The portrait, at first glance, looks like thousands of others taken in the year 1916. The studio is dim but formal, with painted arches on the backdrop and a vase of artificial ivy placed carefully to the side. The photographer, sweating beneath the heat of the oil lamps, instructed the couple to stand still. Exposure times had shortened since the century's turn, but patience was still demanded, and stillness was still dignity. The groom stands rigid, a dark suit pressed sharply against his broad shoulders, hair combed flat and shining with pomade. His jaw is stern, his gaze fixed not on his bride, but into the distance beyond the camera, as if daring the lens to challenge him. The bride stands beside him in a heavy gown of satin, the fabric pooling at her feet, the veil framing her face like a cage of lace. Her bouquet, roses already drooping in the heat of the lamps, is clutched tightly to her chest. Her expression is solemn, but in that era, solemnity was expected. Smiling for photographs was considered undignified, even frivolous. To anyone who saw the image later, nothing would appear strange. A young man, a young woman, joined in matrimony, captured for posterity. A proud moment, meant to hang in parlors, to be shown to children, to testify to respectability. And yet, if you linger, if your eyes travel from the bouquet to the folds of satin, to the hand meant to rest gracefully against her dress, you see it. Her fingers are not relaxed. They curl inward, tense, a fist, rather than an open palm. Between them, faint but undeniable, lies the corner of something folded, a scrap of paper, a letter. It is such a small detail one could dismiss it as accident. Perhaps she clutched a handkerchief. Perhaps she adjusted her gown. But once you see it, you cannot look away. The photographer did not notice. The groom did not notice. But the camera, impartial and merciless, caught it forever. A bride holding not only flowers but her secret, clenched in her hand, as though her life depended on it. Her name was Clara, and she was 19 when the photograph was taken. She was the second daughter of a tailor, a man who measured his life in inches of cloth, who valued neatness and respect above all else. Her mother was a practical woman, hands always busy with mending, hair always pulled back, eyes sharp with the vigilance of survival. Clara grew up in a household where work was constant and expectations were clear. She learned early how to hem and stitch, how to polish shoes until they shone, how to speak only when spoken to. She and her sisters shared a small room above the shop, where the smell of pressed wool and chalk dust seeped into their dreams. Sundays meant church, where appearances mattered more than sermons, where the family's place in the pews reflected their standing in the town. The year was 1916, and though whispers of war filtered across the Atlantic, life in their small American town was still bound by older rules. A daughter's duty was to marry, to secure her future by aligning with a man respectable enough to be approved. Dreams, if they existed, were stitched quietly into pillowcases or pressed between pages of hymnals. Clara had her dreams, faint, fragile things, but she learned to hide them well. She was not rebellious by nature. She did not shout or defy. But there was a gentleness in her that longed for kindness, a softness that hungered for laughter. She noticed the world keenly, the way light fell through leaves, the way music drifted from the tavern, the way her little sister's laughter filled a room. She tucked those things inside herself, storing them like secret treasures. When the groom, Charles Whitmore, began to call, her parents were pleased. He was 10 years older, already established as an accountant at the mill. He dressed neatly, spoke confidently, carried himself with authority. To a father worried about his daughter's dowry, to a mother wary of gossip, Charles was a fine match. Clara did not feel the same. There was something in his gaze that unsettled her. When he looked at her, it was not with warmth, but with appraisal, as though she were a suit he was considering for purchase. His compliments came not as tender words, but as evaluations. You will make a capable wife. You keep yourself tidy. He praised her obedience, never her laughter. Her unease grew in the small moments. When she once laughed too loudly at her sister's jest, Charles's hand clamped on her wrist beneath the table, a subtle squeeze that left her skin tingling with warning. When she expressed hesitation about the speed of their engagement, he smiled thinly and told her not to be childish. Security is not something one questions, he said. Her parents saw none of this. They saw only his suit, his job, his steady presence. He will provide for you, her mother said firmly. That is what matters. Clara tried to argue, softly, timidly, but each attempt was met with the same refrain: gratitude, not hesitation. A daughter did not choose, a daughter accepted. The courtship was swift. Charles visited every Sunday, taking tea with her parents, speaking of accounts and ledgers. He rarely spoke to Clara directly, except to correct her posture or comment on her chores. When he did, it was to remind her of expectations. A wife should not chatter, he said once. A wife should know her place. His tone was not cruel, but final. Clara's sisters teased her gently, admiring the ring he had given her, a thin band set with a modest stone. You're lucky, one whispered. He'll take care of you. Clara smiled faintly, but said nothing. Inside, she felt a hollowness grow. It was during this time that she began to write. Not letters to friends. She had few she could trust, but notes to herself. Fragments scrawled on scraps of paper hidden in her sewing box. I am not sure. I am afraid of his eyes. This is not what I wanted. She wrote quickly, her hand trembling, then folded the slips and hid them as though they were sins. The act of writing gave her a strange comfort. It was the only place she could be honest. The words did not argue, did not silence her. They simply existed, proof that she had thought them. She feared discovery, but she feared silence more. When the engagement was announced, neighbors congratulated her parents. A fine match, they said. She will be secure. Clara nodded, accepted the embraces, smiled as expected. But each night, she unfolded her slips of paper, read the words, and knew that beneath the surface, she carried another truth. The wedding was set for autumn. Preparations filled the weeks. Her gown altered by her father, lace purchased by her mother, invitations delivered by hand. Clara moved through it all, like someone walking in a dream. She did not resist. Resistance was impossible. But each day she wrote. And on the morning of her wedding, she wrote one final letter, longer, clearer, sharper than the rest. I do not want this. I am afraid. If ever this photograph is seen, know that my hand held the truth, even as my lips spoke vows. She folded it tightly, pressing the creases with trembling fingers. She slipped it into her glove, between her palm and the satin. She did not tell anyone. She did not dare. But when she walked into the studio that afternoon, veil pinned, bouquet trembling in her grasp, she felt its weight against her skin like a heartbeat. And when the photographer lifted his hand, when Charles's grip tightened on her shoulder, she refused to open her fist. The letter remained, clenched in her hand. The flash burned. The portrait was captured, and with it, her secret. The morning of her wedding began before dawn. The house bustled with movement, her mother starching linens, her sisters whispering in excitement, her father pacing with pride and nerves. Clara sat before a mirror clouded with age, her hands folded in her lap, her stomach hollow. The gown her father had sewn fit perfectly, each stitch precise, the satin heavy upon her shoulders. Her mother adjusted the veil, pulling it snugly across her brow. pinning it into place with hands that trembled less from sentiment than from determination. Clara said little. She rose when told, lifted her arms when guided, stood still when pins pressed too close. Her sisters chattered around her, admiring the lace, teasing one another about their own futures. But Clara's mind was elsewhere, on the slip of paper she had hidden in her glove, folded into a square so small, yet so unbearable. When she descended the stairs, her father beamed, declaring she looked every bit the lady. Charles stood waiting, his suit pressed, his gaze surveying her not with tenderness, but with possession. He took her arm firmly, almost too firmly, and led her toward the church. Guests turned, smiled, murmured admiration. The organ swelled. The vows were spoken. Her lips formed the words, but her hand remained curled around her letter. Later that afternoon, they went to the photographer's studio, as was tradition. The backdrop was painted to suggest grandeur, a false archway and trailing ivy. The lamps were hot, the air thick with the smell of chemicals. The photographer fussed with his equipment, adjusting exposure, muttering for stillness. Charles posed easily, his jaw proud, his hand placed firmly upon her shoulder. Clara clutched her bouquet, but beneath the flowers, within the folds of satin, her fingers remained locked. The photographer told her to relax her hand. She did not. He told her to let the bouquet sit naturally. She shifted it just enough to shield her clenched fist. The corner of the folded letter pressed against her glove, a detail no one else noticed. The shutter clicked, the flash seared, and in that instant her truth was captured, hidden in plain sight. The portrait was printed weeks later, mounted upon a stiff card, delivered to the couple's home. Charles placed it on the mantel, proud of its solemn dignity. Clara dusted it weakly, her eyes lingering always on her hand, the secret it betrayed. She knew no one else would see. But she saw, and that was enough. Life as Charles's wife settled quickly into routine, though routine felt more like confinement. His house was neat, large enough to impress, but not large enough to feel free. Clara was expected to maintain it flawlessly, meals at precise hours, linens fresh, floors shining. She obeyed, but her spirit dimmed beneath the weight of endless correction. If she laughed too long, he scolded. If she spent too much on bread, he frowned. If she faltered in any way, his hand was there, not always striking, but pressing, guiding, controlling. Neighbors saw a fortunate bride. Charles was steady, respectable, employed in an era when men were scarce due to war. They praised Clara for her luck, for her fine gown, for her husband's position. She smiled faintly, thanked them, and returned to her tasks. No one asked what she felt. No one cared to. The letter she had carried on her wedding day remained hidden. She tucked it into her sewing box, beneath folded fabrics. Some evenings, when the house was quiet and Charles had gone to accounts or meetings, she unfolded it. The paper was creased, the ink faded slightly from the press of her fingers. She read the words again. I do not want this. I am afraid. If ever this photograph is seen, know that my hand held the truth. The words steadied her. They reminded her that her silence was not total, that somewhere her defiance had been recorded. She folded it again carefully, returned it to its place, and went on. Months turned into years. She bore a child, a boy, then another, a girl. Motherhood filled her days with ceaseless labor, but also with flickers of joy. She saw her children laugh, and in their laughter she glimpsed the life she longed for. She shielded them when she could from Charles's severity, taught them gentleness in whispers, tucked them in at night with songs too soft for him to hear. The photograph watched over them all from the mantel. Guests admired it, noting the bride's elegance, the groom's seriousness. No one looked at her hand. No one saw the corner of the folded paper. But Clara saw it every time she dusted. every time she passed. It was her reminder that beneath the surface of obedience, she had left a mark. In 1918, the influenza came. It swept through the town like a storm, filling houses with fever, churches with mourning. Streets emptied, shops closed, coffins filled. Neighbors who had smiled at her days before were gone within a week. The sound of church bells tolling became constant, a dirge for the living as much as for the dead. Clara fell ill. Fever gripped her. Sweat drenched her sheets. Her breath came ragged. Charles paced the halls, fearful not for her, but for the household's order. The children, terrified, clung to one another. For days she drifted between dreams and delirium, her mind clinging to fragments of memory. Her father's shop, her mother's hymns, the studio's flash, the feel of paper pressed into her palm. She thought she would die. But she did not. The fever broke. Her breath steadied. She survived while others perished. Her younger sister succumbed, as did two neighbors. The grief was sharp, but beneath it was a strange clarity. She had stared at death and returned. She knew then that her life, however controlled, however silent, carried weight. The letter, once only a confession, became something more. It was proof of survival, a record that she had spoken truth even when silenced. She began to see it not only as her secret, but as her inheritance to her children. She hoped one day they would understand, though she never dared tell them. The years passed. The influenza waned, the town rebuilt, but the memory remained. Clara moved through her days as before, cooking, cleaning, enduring Charles's commands. But something within her had shifted. She no longer saw herself as powerless. Quiet, yes. Controlled, yes. But within her sewing box lay the folded scrap that proved she had once clenched her hand against the world. That strength, however hidden, was hers. After influenza, time rearranged itself. It did not grow kinder, but it grew clearer. War headlines ebbed, parades returned to Main Street. The mill's whistle punctuated the mornings again. Clara kept house as she always had, but there was a steadiness in her now that no command could shake. She understood that the life inside her, the one that wrote, that kept a folded truth beneath satin and years, could not be extinguished by scolding or ceremony. The children stretched upward, as children do. The boy, Samuel, was thoughtful in ways that surprised her. He watched faces the way tailors watch seams, noticing where strain gathered. The girl, Rose, laughed with her whole body and then covered her mouth as if she had broken a rule. Clara would touch the back of her hand lightly to say, "Keep laughing." She never said the words aloud when Charles was in the room, but the touch spoke for her. Charles remained reliable in public and immovable in private. He paid the mortgage on time, polished his shoes, folded the newspaper in precise quarters. He did not strike daily or even weekly. Control, for him, worked better as a threat than a habit. He corrected. He checked accounts, scolded waste, parceled out coin. His notion of husbandry was as narrow as a ledger, columns balanced, margins tight, no unknowns tolerated. Clara learned invisible routes around him, the way a river learns the shape of its bank. On Tuesdays, she took in small alterations for neighbors, endless hems, a let-out seam for a boy who'd grown, darts added to a blouse as a girl changed shape. The coins went into a teacup, hidden behind folded muslin in the sewing box. She did not plan to run. She did not plan at all. Saving, for her, was simply a ceremony of selfhood. Some people light candles. She counted coins. In the same box, beneath the muslin and the teacup, the letter rested, softening at the creases, but intact. Sometimes, when wind worried the old house and she felt the old fright coming, she would set the teacup aside, lift the paper, and read a single line. "I do not want this. I am afraid." She no longer felt shame seeing it. She felt recognition, as if greeting a version of herself who had not been abandoned. Years added themselves to the walls. New wallpaper bloomed over old. A radio appeared on the sideboard, bringing voices from far-off cities into their quiet rooms. When the markets crashed, panic rattled the town like a window in a late storm. Charles tightened. He scolded waste more sharply, made notes about sugar usage, considered the cost of eggs as if counting sins. She did not argue. Instead, she mended what could not be replaced, stretched soup with barley, taught the children that hunger can be gentled with hot water and patience. They learned thrift, but they also learned something else, that her hands could make the small into enough. Samuel left school early to sweep floors at the hardware store. He returned at dark with the smell of nails and oiled wood clinging to him, placing 2 coins on the table with a serious pride that hurt Clara's heart. Rose learned to embroider initials, selling handkerchiefs to ladies who still believed in gentility. Charles accepted the coins with a nod to propriety, as if he too had trained them to be useful tools. He did not see the private exchanges in the kitchen. The way Clara would press a second, hidden coin into Samuel's palm and close his fingers over it. The way she would slip a small length of ribbon into Rose's pocket for no reason, except that color should exist. The portrait watched from the mantel. Guests still admired it. On winter evenings, when neighbors came by for card games and careful gossip, someone would inevitably say, "That's a picture that will stand the test of time years," and everyone would nod at the solemn bride and the resolute groom. No one's gaze wandered to the bride's hand, softened now by dustings and decades. But sometimes, when the guests had gone and the house settled into its nighttime creaks, Clara would stand before the frame and study her own face. 19, a veil pinned so tight it left a faint impression on the skin. She would search for something brave in that image and find it not in her eyes, which looked dutiful, but in her fist, which did not. Samuel grew into a man who measured his temper as carefully as his tools. He married a quiet woman with a laugh like rain and took a job that carried him out of town, to a city with streetcars and menus printed on paper. Rose lingered longer, reluctant to leave the house where she had learned the grammar of survival. This look means hush. This look means now speak. This look means carry your joy privately to the room at the top of the stairs. She became a seamstress more by destiny than choice. Stitches were the family's second language. Men called on her, several decent, 1 or 2 appealing. Charles dismissed each as insufficient. "A father knows," he said, which meant that he wished his control to last another season. Time, the slowest negotiator, did its work. Charles's hair thinned. His walk, once domination turned into sound, softened into shuffle. His voice still could slice, but it did not cut as deep. When Samuel visited, he stood taller than his father and did not duck. When Rose stayed out late helping a neighbor birth a child, she came home to reprimand, but did not flinch. Light gathered in the house in ways it had not before, still thin, but noticeable, the way dawn first enters a room with more suggestion than presence. Clara never confronted. She also never apologized for existing. Her form of rebellion was repetition: soup on the table, mended shirts, coins saved, letter preserved. She began, in a strange way, to view the letter less as defiance and more as inheritance. If she could not narrate her life aloud, if she could not stand at a church picnic and declare, "This is what happened and this is who I was," then perhaps the paper would do it for her later. So she wrapped it in muslin one spring, the muslin her father had used for fittings, and stitched it closed along 3 sides, leaving a narrow mouth as if it were a pillowcase for a secret. She slid the paper inside, stitched the opening shut, and set the small, soft parcel at the bottom of the sewing box, beneath a false cardboard bottom Samuel had made for her years before. She did not think of this as hiding. She thought of it as writing in a language the house would keep. Children interpret silence in several dialects. Samuel believed the world's volume existed outside the door. The clang of rail, the clap of hammers, the noise of cities. Inside, quiet, was safety. He loved his mother with the fidelity of a compass. She was north, even when clouds hid the sky. He seldom asked about the past. He had learned early that questions could be invitations to anger. Yet sometimes he would enter the room and find his mother with 2 fingers pressed lightly against the frame of the wedding portrait. He would stand beside her, not touching, and look. "You were very pretty," he would say, and he meant the kind of pretty that is really persistence. She would smile with an expression that could only be called qualified joy. Rose kept noticing. She was the one who saw the way the skin at the base of her mother's thumb had a faint callus, not from needles or knives, but from where a fist had often formed. She was the one who learned to place the kettle on just before the key scraped the door, because tea, immediately hot, could temper some commands. She was also the one who laughed more and more, as if deciding that joy is a contraband worth smuggling openly. When a boy named Thomas brought her a book of poems and stood awkwardly on the porch reciting 2 lines about light and burden, she felt something unthread inside her, not coming apart, but releasing. Charles did not approve of Thomas. The young man taught at the school, which Charles called soft work, and owned more books than suits. "A household needs spine," Charles said. "A library is not a backbone." He underestimated the sturdiness of pages. Thomas waited. Waiting, it turns out, can be its own kind of defiance. He would tip his hat at Charles, carry coal in when winter thickened, fix a broken chair without asking, and then stand with Rose on the porch speaking very quietly of things that existed beyond ledgers. Weather patterns, the shape of starlight, the particular way grief changes the color of rooms. Clara did not maneuver. She also did not discourage. She sewed for neighbors, mended for pay, saved coins, and taught Rose to cut fabric with intention. "A seam," she whispered once while guiding the shears, "decides the shape of a life." Rose looked up quickly, wanting to ask, but the moment closed. Still, the sentence stayed. Eventually, Thomas and Rose married in a small ceremony, set on a day Charles could not forbid, the day Samuel came home and stood on one side of his father while Thomas stood on the other, and somehow the geometry of 3 men who would not move created a corridor through which a wedding could pass. Clara wore a blue dress, not black, not grey. On the mantel at home, the 1916 portrait watched a second generation arrange themselves differently. Hands not gripping shoulders, eyes actually meeting eyes. After the wedding meal ended and guests had dispersed, Rose lingered to help her mother wash dishes. She dried the same plate 3 times, then set the cloth down. "Did you ever want to leave?" she asked, the question shaped so softly it might have been breath. Clara rinsed a cup. The water ran thin and clear. "I wanted us to live," she said finally. It was not an answer the world would mark as sufficient, but it was true. Age is a slow clarifier, like sunlight traveling across a room to reveal dust in the golden hour. Charles shrank into the lines he had drawn for himself. His chair, once a throne, became a post. His newspaper, once weapon, became blanket. He still offered instruction, but without the force that once enforced it. When illness came, less a strike than a steady erasure, he took to bed in the front room, where light tilted in through lace curtains and made a complicated pattern on the quilt. He demanded broth and the right temperature of water and the precise stack of pillows. Clara brought what he asked for. She was not cruel. She was not tender either. She was exact, which is another way of preserving one's dignity in a house that once sought to remove it. On an evening in late autumn, when the maple outside had already thrown most of its leaves to the ground, and the porch smelled faintly of drying wood, Charles called for her, with a voice that reached only halfway across the room. She stepped closer. He gestured to the mantel where the portrait still stood in a newer frame Samuel had bought. "You kept it," he said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. "Yes," she replied. "It belongs to the house." He nodded, as if the logic satisfied some ledger in his mind. He closed his eyes and did not open them again. The house steadied after he died. Grief did not rush in the way it does when a good man goes. It entered like weather, something to accommodate, not to celebrate, not to deny. Neighbors brought pies and kind talk. The minister spoke of duty. Clara made coffee in a larger pot than usual. In the quiet after, she stood before the portrait a long time, then lifted it down. She took off the backboard, loosened the small bent nails, and ran her fingers along the edge of the mounting. For a moment, she considered sliding the letter into the space behind the photo. But she did not want her truth to become only a phantom, hidden in another silence. She placed the photograph back on the mantel and returned the letter to its muslin envelope, to the sewing box, to the false bottom. Not hiding. Keeping. Her body thinned in the years that followed, but her presence did not. She walked to market with a basket on her arm, nodded at vendors who knew her by her exacting hems, and kept a small garden that produced more surprises than any ledger could predict. A second crop of beans into October, strawberries that insisted upon sweetness despite a late frost. She visited Rose and Thomas on Sundays and let herself be the kind of grandmother who offers each child a ribbon, a marble, a sentence of blessing instead of a law. Samuel sent letters from the city full of the honorable boredom of good work and photographs of his quiet family on stoops. He had kept something back from the household he grew up in, a space he guarded, a room with sunlight. Clara wrote less on paper. She no longer needed to confess. She had become the confession and the absolution both. But sometimes, on winter nights when wind bullied the eaves, she would lift the muslin envelope, touch it with 3 fingers, and then set it down again. It felt like patting a pocket where matches live, the comfort of knowing there is a way to cool light if needed. When the stroke came, it was a gentle thief. It took her left side and left her right hand, the one that had clenched in the portrait, intact. She learned to do small things one-handed. She asked Rose to label tins in larger letters. She let Thomas fold the quilts. She accepted help the way she had offered it for years, without fanfare, without a speech forgiving in advance those who were trying. The day they carried her into the front room because it had become the best room for the end of her life, she asked that the portrait be set where she could see it. When the sun traveled across the floor and up the wall and brushed the frame with the last light of afternoon, she smiled, a real smile, unposed, and let her eyes close. Grief rearranges drawers. After the funeral and the casseroles and the stray handkerchiefs left behind by visitors, Rose and Samuel returned to the house to do the work of ending. They wrapped teacups in newspaper, folded linens, packed books. Each object felt heavier than its weight, as if the air around it had thickened with meaning. Samuel took down the portrait carefully and set it on the table, frame facing down, as if the image might need a rest from being looked at. It was Rose who opened the sewing box last. She knew its layers the way one knows the pattern of a lullaby. She removed the top tray of buttons, set aside the neat rows of needles, lifted spools of thread that had held small economies together. Beneath the muslin, her fingers found cardboard that was not quite flush, a false bottom. She slid her nails under and lifted. There lay the small parcel, soft as a bird in a nest. She hesitated. Something reverent moved through her. Not fear, not exactly. Or, perhaps, the respectful kind that belongs in church, but has somehow found itself in a kitchen. Samuel, dust on his sleeves, came to stand beside her. She placed the parcel in his hand, and with the care of a man removing a splinter from a child's palm, he unpicked Clara's stitches along the seam. Inside, the paper lay folded as precisely as a vow. The creases had grown into the fibers. The ink had thinned but not vanished. Rose unfolded it, flattening it gently against the clean table. The words rose up as if breathed back to life. I do not want this. I am afraid. If ever this photograph is seen, know that my hand held the truth even as my lips spoke vows. The room did not change shape. The world did not tilt. But their understanding altered, as if someone had opened a window they hadn't known was painted shut. Rose reached for the portrait and turned it over. She stared at the image she had dusted all her life and saw it for the first time as the testimony it had always been. There, against satin, was the fist. There, between fingers, the faint edge of paper. So small, so persistent, so final. Oh, she said, with a softness that held both grief and gratitude. Mother. Samuel did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was low, almost a stranger to itself. She told us, he said, and we never heard. He did not mean they were to blame. He meant that bravery sometimes chooses a frequency that can only be tuned in later, when the house is quiet enough to listen. They did not show the letter to many. They were not interested in town talk, in making an exhibit of pain. Instead, they placed the letter in a new muslin envelope, stitched again. Their stitches not as neat as Clara's, but honest. They tucked it into a book of poems Thomas had given Rose decades earlier, and slid the book on the shelf below the portrait. The house seemed to nod, as houses sometimes do when a truth has been honored. Years pass, photographs yellow, corners soften, new frames replace old. Children who were carried into the front room to say goodbye become adults who carry boxes out to cars. But certain images outlive their captions. The 1916 portrait, stiff with its formalities, continues to gaze calmly at anyone who will look. It shows an obedient bride and a proud groom in an age that worshipped those shapes. And yet, if you let your sight fall from the veil to the bouquet to the hand, the real story rises. A fist is not a common wedding symbol. The world prefers rings and roses, but her fist holds the letter, and the letter holds a sentence, and the sentence holds a life. That is how truth sometimes travels, nested, quiet, airless for years, then opened at a kitchen table by hands that know the weight of what they are doing. What does one do with such knowledge? Perhaps nothing grand. Perhaps one does not publish or accuse or rewrite every family story. Perhaps one simply looks at the portrait and refuses to accept the first meaning it offers. Perhaps one goes on telling the children at the supper table that laughter is allowed here. Perhaps one buys ribbon when there is no reason for ribbon except color. Perhaps one learns that survival can look like soup ladled out again and again with steadiness, like coins saved in a teacup no one thinks to lift, like a letter folded so small it could fit beneath a thumb and still hold a world. Clara did not overthrow history. She did not run from the church or set fire to the house or stand in the public square naming names. She held paper. She kept it. She made a seam where there had been none. And then the garment of a life could move. In an age that misread silence as consent, she taught silence another language, witness. Now, when Rose dusts the frame in her own home, the portrait following her because some reliquaries must, she does not dust the fist quickly, as if it were a flaw. She lingers there, 2 gentle circles with the cloth, a small blessing offered to the girl inside the lace who refused to open her hand. Sometimes a grandchild asks why the bride looks sad. Rose answers truthfully, without telling everything. It was a serious time. And later, when that child is older and has learned how to see, Rose will show them the letter, the muslin, the neat old stitches, the folded square, the ink that survived a century. She will teach them where to look, not at the announced features, the arch, the suit, the bouquet, but at the small, defiant edges the world tries to blur. And if the child asks what the secret means, Rose will say that photographs can lie, and also tell the truth, that both things can live in the same rectangle of paper. She will say that people sometimes manage to smuggle themselves past a moment meant to trap them. She will say that courage is not always a shout. It can be a held breath, a clenched hand, a sentence written to oneself and kept for a lifetime. If you, a stranger in a later year, come upon the portrait in a shop or a book or a dusty album at an estate sale and pause, if your eye travels the way hers hoped it would, from the veil to the bouquet to the fist, you will feel it too. The heat of lamps, the smell of chemicals, the weight of satin, the pressure of paper against palm. You will understand that the young woman was not an emblem of compliance. She was a cipher. She left a key where future hands could find it. This is how the past speaks, when it is not permitted a voice. In margins, in corners, in slight tensions the lens cannot smooth. In 1916, a bride closed her fingers around a letter and stood very still, and the camera, doing what cameras do at their best, made a record of the exact place where a life refused to disappear. The rest of the world labeled the image a wedding portrait. She called it a message. Time agreed with her. Look again. The secret is not dark because it is shameful. It is dark because it lived where light could not touch it for a long while. Now it has the light it deserves. Now it can be read. Now, when you see her hand, you know it is not nervousness or accidents of cloth. It is a declaration, compressed to the size of a thumbnail, preserved in silver, waiting more than 100 years for you to notice and say, finally and aloud, I see you. And somewhere, in whatever country the gone inhabit, Clara, no longer 19, no longer clenched, unfolds herself fully and smiles.